Hello everybody, and welcome to the latest in our series of Life Sciences webcasts. Today we're going to be looking at another current issue life sciences and healthcare companies are facing, implementing information systems while operating under multiple sets of regulations. In particular today we're looking at SOX. We'll look at where companies can utilize controls they already have in place to meet regulatory expectations for SOX. Companies in healthcare and life sciences are already highly regulated by GxP and a host of other regulations. Most already have IT controls in place. We'll talk about how to leverage those controls to help meet SOX requirements, so you're not putting duplicates or redundant controls in place. My name's Dave Hawley, and I'm one of the directors of the Regulatory Compliance Division of Business and Decision North America. I started in the life sciences industry in 1984 as a chemical engineer and held a number of positions in the industry in engineering, production of pharmaceutical products and medical devices, IT and compliance. I joined Business and Decision, or as it then was known as MI Services, in 2004 in the United Kingdom and moved to the US in 2006. And since then I've worked on numerous projects in the USA, the UK, Europe, Asia and elsewhere. Also joining us today is Ashley Peacock, the other Director of Regulatory Compliance for Business and Decision North America. Ashley's worked in the regulated industries for more than 15 years, with over a decade directly in the life sciences industry. Ashley's got extensive experience in quality management and IS compliance, and along with me is directly responsible for the delivery of IS compliance services within the North American market and to certain global projects. Ashley is also a certified HIPAA professional, CHP, and is well versed in applying privacy and security controls to comply with a wide set of standards and regulations at organisations within the healthcare industry. We do have some newcomers joining us again for our webcast today, so if our regular viewers will bear with us, we'll quickly explain how the technology works. You can ask a question at any time by pressing the Ask a Question button and typing your answer in the pop-up box. I'll collect the questions during the webcast and we'll answer them in the question and answer session at the end. If we do run out of time to address your live questions, we'll make sure that we post the answers on our Life Sciences blog, which we'll remind you about later. We should tell you that this session is being recorded and will be available after the event, along with copies of the slides. You or your colleagues can watch the recording or download the slides from the Business and Decision Life Sciences and Healthcare website, where we now have a library of over 50 life sciences webcasts covering a wide variety of topics. As usual, we'll be sending a link to today's event, which will allow you to download a copy of the slides. At the end of the session, we'll also ask for your comments, feedback and ratings, which you can provide by pressing the Rate This button. We'll remind you about that at the end of today's session. During today's session, we'll go through an overview of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, more commonly known as SOX, and discuss how it impacts information systems and the IT departments that support them. Then we'll talk briefly about FDA expectations around IS. Because most of today's attendees are already familiar with operating in a GxP environment, we won't spend a lot of time on this, but we do want to make sure we cover the basics so we're all using the same basic assumptions about GxP compliance when we talk about streamlining SOX and GxP. After that, we'll spend some time talking about the similarities and differences between SOX requirements and the IS requirements at GxP facilities. We've noticed that companies seem to treat SOX compliance and FDA or GxP compliance as completely separate initiatives. That approach leaves them with redundant systems, which is never cost-effective, and with an overtaxed IT department trying to conform with mandates both from the QA departments and from the financial compliance officers. Neither of these approaches works particularly well, so we're going to discuss where your existing FDA compliance systems and procedures can be used for a more holistic approach to IS compliance, and where GxP systems need to be expanded to meet the requirements of SOX and vice versa. Companies with existing SOX controls in place looking to expand into the life sciences can leverage their financial IS controls as a basis for the GxP IS systems. As always, we'll leave some time at the end for questions and answers, as I said. So please feel free to submit those at any time during today's presentation. I'm going to hand over to Ashley Peacock now, who's going to start us off with an overview of the regulation. Ashley.
Thanks, Dave. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act was passed in 2002, so it's been around 10, 11 years now, 12. And it had a couple different names along the way as it made its way through the Senate and the House, but most of us know it today simply as SOX. And it was a very direct response to some of the major corporate scandals we saw in the late 1990s. I'm sure you all remember, hearing about Enron and Adelphia, and there were several others, but huge scandals and cost investors billions of dollars. It's one of the fastest pieces of legislation that's ever made it through Congress, overwhelmingly approved. Not a single senator voted against it. I think one person abstained, and like 3 members of the House voted against it. So this was really kind of unprecedented. It had huge public support, and to the best of my knowledge, nothing has passed with those odds since. There's 11 sections to it. I'll go into a little bit more detail on each one of those in a minute. But they're all really looking to make sure that the financial data is available, that the data is accurate, and that the individuals involved in creating that data are responsible for its accuracy. Now, obviously, any U.S. legislation only applies to the United States and companies in the United States, but the Act has had some pretty significant international impact as well. 9 other countries have passed very similar legislation, including places like Japan and France and Germany. So, economically significant countries that we do a lot of business with, countries where oftentimes our businesses have other offices. And I point this out for 2 reasons. First, oftentimes we go into companies and they say, we don't need to comply with SOX because we're not headquartered in the U.S. And this is certainly absolutely technically true. But if you're using that, you also want to make sure that you go back and look at the regulations in your own country, because the odds are pretty good that you have some very similar regulations. In fact, a lot of them are almost identical. The Japan, they actually call it JSOX. So more and more countries are implementing SOX or SOX-like requirements. And you don't want to, implement a new information system today and not include the financial controls, and then find out 6 months from now that you've got to go back and completely retool your system or re-implement it altogether because you didn't put these controls in the first time. I think it's safe to say for all of us that financial controls and requirements around transparency are just going to continue to increase regardless of where you do business and regardless of the size of your company. We're not going to get more lax in this area. We'll talk a little bit later about the FDA controls for information systems, but I think it's interesting to kind of think as we go through here about how some of the newer regulations are going to impact the FDA regulation long term. In GxP environments, there are certainly requirements around reporting adverse events when patients are negatively affected very directly. But other than that, companies have really been pretty much left alone to manage their own quality, unless the FDA comes in and audits, which they do somewhat regularly, but there's not a real, requirement for proactive notification. One of the things that we see in newer regulations, things like SOX, things like HIPAA, and we'll go into a lot of detail of HIPAA today, but there's this concept of mandatory reporting so that when something goes wrong, you have to proactively notify the appropriate agencies, your auditors, the Department of Health and Human Services, so that even if there wasn't a negative impact directly on somebody, you still have to notify that there was a breakdown in the system. So I think it'll actually be very interesting to see if the FDA moves that same direction that we're seeing really every other regulatory body moving. So as I mentioned on the last slide, this act passed very quickly. It passed almost unanimously. It was very well received by both sides, and there really wasn't a lot of pushback from industry. When you look at the details of the regulation, which I said we'll do in a moment, you'll see there isn't really anything in here that's terribly different from what good companies would be doing anyway. We say that a lot about FDA regulation as well, that it really comes down to things that, documenting your existing good practices. But just like FDA compliance, it certainly comes with a cost. In about 2007, they said the cost of compliance was estimated 3 to 4% of your revenues. Compliance costs were decreasing, which is what we'd expect. There was an initial hurdle to get compliant, but once you're through that initial implement these controls, validate my systems, the day-to-day operations tend to level out and not be as expensive. The big thing that doesn't go away is the cost of external auditors. That is a definite increase in cost that companies have to maintain long term. In 2011, the SEC looked at this. The previous surveys had been done by independent companies, but the SEC shows that the costs to comply are continuing to decline. The companies that are really hardest hit, which we always see in regulation, are the small companies. Audits are very expensive. They represent a much larger percentage of the revenue. And so they really feel that hit to the bottom line, which we've seen with SOX has impacted the stock prices. Foley & Lardner did a survey in 2007, and almost 70% of respondents felt that companies under $251 million should be exempt from Section 404. And we'll talk a little bit more about Section 404, but it has to do with the reporting. And another study, just kind of an interesting point here, because it did hurt some of the small firms, but they did another study and they took 2,500 companies and we looked at companies with SOX weaknesses versus those without. And what they found was that highly compliant companies had about a 10% higher share price. I know this oftentimes surprises people that are going through the initial pain and expense of getting compliance and trying to figure out how they're going to restructure their systems, and it doesn't seem like there's an ROI. But it's another regulation that, like I said a minute ago, it's just enforcing good business practices. And what we see is that when companies, use good business practices, long term they tend to be more profitable. So there's 11 major elements or 11 titles in the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. I'm going to walk through each one of these. Most of them I'm going to kind of breeze through because I want to focus on the things that really impact information systems and IT. But I also want to make sure that you have some kind of context as to what the regulation as a whole means. I know sitting in IT, it's very difficult when they come in and say, well, you've got to implement these controls, and not really understanding the thinking and the purpose behind them and kind of what those controls feed into. So Title I establishes the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. This acronym PCAOB, which I find impossible to remember, but it talks about how we register auditors. Doesn't have a lot to do with IT. Title II talks about the auditor independence. One of the things we saw in the fallout of the 90s was that the same firms were providing too many services to their clients, and so there was a lot of conflict of interest. So Title II prevents that from happening. It says you cannot consult and then audit the same systems that you consulted to implement. It also has some requirements around making sure that you use approved auditors and that you don't use the same auditors every year, so that you get, you kind of lose independence when you build long-term relationships like that. So Title III, corporate responsibility. This is really where kind of the meat of the regulation lies. And this is when you talk to IT people or people that aren't directly involved in auditing, really what they think about when you talk about SOX compliance. And it does really just what the title says. It requires corporations to be responsible for their own actions. It holds individuals accountable for their own actions, and it forces them to keep track of what's going on around them. So you kind of lose this, well, I didn't know what he was doing. It's now your obligation to find out what's happening around you. Most of this is kind of expected under good accounting principles and just kind of general ethical standards, but SOX made this the law because we saw that people weren't always following those standards that they should. So when you submit a financial report, you need to know what's on it and you're accountable for that data. Section 302 is the part that we really care about for IT purposes. The rest of Title III talks about the process, and it talks about individual responsibility. Section 302 is where we really start talking about the technical controls that need to occur so that individuals can reasonably be accountable and that they can be making good decisions on that financial data. So Section 302.2 established safeguards against, to prevent data tampering. Anybody that works with SOX hears a lot about segregation of duties, and that's one of the things we try to implement here on a technical level. So not only have we assigned appropriate roles and responsibilities to employees, you need to make sure that you implement your system in such a way that people can't access or change data, that they can't tamper with things that are not appropriate to their role. This is also where it requires us to protect our data from outside tampering. So kind of basic corporate policies around IT security and virus protection and firewalls, and making sure that people are not hacking into your system. Section 302.3 requires companies to establish safeguards for a timeline. Your signing officer needs to approve that the information on their report is correct for the time period. So obviously you kind of need to know what that time period was. This is one that's usually pretty simple to implement. This is timestamps, making sure that timestamps aren't changed, and that you have some basic provisions so that your time is correct. We sync our server to a reliable source, and the timestamps are automatically put on, so I'm not able to backdate something. 302.4b, establish verifiable controls to track data access. This is a very critical section. This is designed to ensure officers see all of the relevant data. So we put a lot of controls in place saying you are responsible for everything you report on. We also need to make sure that people are getting all the data. So you need to demonstrate, you need to make sure no data is obscured, so it is all accessible. And also we keep track of who saw the data and how the data was accessed, so that you don't have this, well, I didn't know, well, I didn't see it. You want to be able to report who accessed the data and how they accessed it. 302.4c, verify safeguards. This is the one that usually gets a little exciting and sometimes difficult for companies that are new to SOX compliance. After you put all of your controls in place, you have to verify that they actually work. And you can't just put it in, say, I put this control and never test it. For people that come from the FDA side of things that are used to working in GxP environment, this just seems like common sense. We've been doing validation for years, and it's part of standard implementation practice. People on the finance side are not usually used to this degree of verification. Often they are from a process standpoint, but not necessarily from a documentation standpoint here. So this is a place where it is excellent to utilize your GxP resources. One thing I do want to point out here, oftentimes in GxP validation, we tend to get very focused on testing the software and not looking at really verifying the process as a whole and the processes around the software. Not the best way to do validation, not really the way we should do it in a GxP world, but it certainly is the way it often happens. And I just point this out because particularly in a SOX environment, the verification of the non-technical pieces becomes much more important. You need to make sure that those controls work, and oftentimes those controls are not system generated, they're people and their processes. 302.4d, periodic reporting. You need to go back and you need to check regularly that your controls work and that your processes are working. This is another area where if we're doing it really well in GxP world, we do this, but because it's not an explicit regulatory requirement on the GxP side, sometimes this piece is missed. And 302.5b, looking for breaches, detecting breaches. This is another thing that most companies do it as part of their regular IT practice. You need to be making sure that you are actively looking for security breaches, whether that be malicious or whether that be a gap in the software or control that just didn't work. You have an obligation to try to find those breaches. So Title IV, this is the other section that really kind of directly impacts IT departments. And basically what this says here is that you need to tell your auditors what your plan is, what safeguards you've put in place, how you're enforcing your processes, and then if something goes wrong, you need to report out on it. All of that means you have to document it, right? I can't prove that I'm doing this. I can't prove that I've tested it if I don't have the documentation to support it. And this is another area where it is often difficult or new to IT departments that have not worked in a regulated space before. They're usually used to doing the testing. They're not usually used to doing the level of documentation that's required or the rigor of testing that's required. So it's another really good place to pull from your GxP colleagues who are very used to, what does a test plan look like, and how do I pragmatically test? How do I use risk to design my tests? Who do I need to have in my tests? If you're used to working in validation, these are very, very transferable concepts. So the last three titles, not a whole lot of impact on IT. Title IX talks about the penalties for white-collar crime. Basically, again, people are accountable, and it is a criminal act. Title X has to do with corporate tax returns. It requires, officers to actually sign and be personally accountable. Title XI gives the SEC some powers to freeze corporate transactions if they see things that look suspect. So I'm going to hand it back to Dave now to talk about the regulation of information systems from an FDA side.
Okay, thanks, Ashley. First of all, we've had a couple of questions come in about possible dial-in to get the sound on this webcast. I'm afraid it isn't possible. It is only possible through the computer. And somebody else asked about getting the copies of the slides. That will be via a link which will email out to everybody who registered for the webcast. And if you're listening to the recording, get in touch by the Business and Decision Life Sciences website. So, as we mentioned earlier, we're not going to go into a lot of detail around the specifics of FDA regulation, both in the interest of time and in the light of the fact that the majority of our audience today comes from a life sciences background and is already very aware of what the regulations are. But I do want to cover some key concepts which I think will highlight the parallels in FDA and SEC regulation. And while it's not part of our agenda today, those of you who are familiar with HIPAA will recognize the same basic story. The FDA is the oldest consumer protection agency in the United States. Basically, individuals were selling products that were adulterated or misbranded, and the government stepped in to put a stop to it. In those days, the issues are largely around misbranding and stories about snake oil and magic tonic and such like. And what people found that these products rarely did anything good. So the FDA was created, and the Pure Food and Drugs Act of 1906 was enacted. This is not that different to what the SEC saw during the financial scandals that unfolded in the late 20th century in America. Companies were putting out great financial reports, but there was no data to back it up. It was just snake oil. The FDA regulations have grown and changed a lot since that time. We now have good clinical practice, good laboratory practice, good manufacturing practice, and this list continues to expand as we look at things like good pharmacovigilance and distribution practices, for example. But while the subject matter varies and some of the nuances of the regulations vary based on the subject at hand, they really all boil down to a few simple but critical concepts. First, we need to make sure that any data we're capturing is true and accurate. In good laboratory practice environments, GLP environments, this may be by checking that the animal weights are correct and fall within a reasonable range. In GMP, good manufacturing practice environments, we look at the quantities of ingredients in a batch. But in the end, we're always looking to ensure that data is captured in such a way that when we report it out or use it in later processes, the data is valid. From an IS perspective, we're most often looking at ensuring data hasn't been lost or changed by a computerized system. Next, we're looking at the safety of our subjects, whether those are animals or people, and whether it's in a clinical or a commercial setting doesn't particularly matter. You have to make sure that your subjects are safe, so we put controls in place to ensure that we're not contaminating product, that potency is correct, etc. This is an area where IS professionals often overlook or play down, as they see it as not really impacted by information technology. Unfortunately, that's simply not true. Most of our manufacturing systems and quality control systems these days are computer-based. If your manufacturing execution system charges too much active pharmaceutical ingredient into a batch, and your LIMS approves a contaminated batch for release, there's a very quick and direct impact on the patient. The GxP regulations have been around for many years, predating computers, and while current interpretations and guidance are fluid, the regulations themselves have remained largely unchanged. They were designed around paper systems and manual equipment. As computers became more prevalent, companies had to begin interpreting the GxPs in new ways, so they didn't always come up with the best interpretations. So in 1997, the FDA enacted 21 CFR Part 11. Part 11 wasn't intended to impose new requirements on companies. It was intended to ensure that the existing GxP regulations were not lost when companies moved from paper to electronic systems. What actually happened is that Part 11 created some panic in the industry and been subject to a lot of revision in the FDA's own guidance documents and enforcement policies. But it boils down to a few basic concepts. First, your systems need to be validated. This goes back to the point on the previous slide about making sure data is valid, that it's reliable, and it's available. You don't want a computer system to invalidate the data you've captured by doing incorrect calculations or losing data. Next, your system needs to have an audit trail. This is an area where Part 11 concerns often kind of spiral out of control very quickly. It doesn't have to be an elaborate external application that captures every keystroke. But you do need to be able to verify who performed an action and when. And you need to make sure that you don't lose any previous data. It's a very simple concept when you're working on paper systems. We all know good documentation practice, single line cross out, initial and date when you change something on paper. Your computer system needs to do the same sort of thing. It's okay to change something, but you can't obscure what was previously entered. And that's often quite a difficult thing to do with some systems. Legacy systems are not particularly relevant for today's topic, but because it's an important point when talking about Part 11, we did want to at least mention them. The FDA has said that they will use enforcement discretion for legacy systems, provided the system was in use prior to Part 11 and met the practical rules at that time. Keep in mind, though, that Part 11 was enacted 16 years ago. So if your system is not that old, and very few systems are, it's not a legacy system. Copies of records and record retention are another area that caused a great deal of angst in companies when Part 11 was first enacted. There was a lot of discussion about what formats were acceptable for copies of records and how data could or could not be stored and presented to the FDA. The agency has said that they will also use enforcement discretion here. Records in any common portable format are okay, and records need to be retained in line with the existing predicate rules. Using a documented risk assessment, companies can determine the best way to archive and store records in the long term. We've talked about SOX and FDA regulations. I'm now going to turn it back to Ashley to talk about how we put these two concepts together. Ashley.
Great, thanks, Steve. So I think if we've done a good job of describing the SOX requirements and the FDA requirements, I hope by the time we get to this slide, things start to sound a little bit redundant. You know, both regulations are looking to protect the integrity of a process, and they're looking to protect the data that it produces. Both of them are ultimately looking to protect their stakeholders. In pharma and medical devices, when we talk about stakeholders, we're usually talking about humans, sometimes animals, but we're looking for physical safety, that we're not giving contaminated product. In the finance world, it's the same thing. You know, we're still looking to protect the stakeholders, to protect the individuals, but here we're looking at their financial investments. At the end of the day, both regulations are seeking to make sure that corporations are not harming individuals. They both require validation. SOX sometimes uses a little bit different language. They talk a lot more about verification, and they talk about, you know, provisions, but they both require verification. They both look to make sure that there is an automated timestamp audit trail, that we can always, you know, see what happened when. They both look at the long-term retention of the data and making sure that you can access data and understand kind of the events that led up to the creation of that data. They're both looking at segregation of duties. This is an area where they're both looking for the same results, so the language is a little bit different here. GxP companies, we usually talk about roles and responsibilities and independent quality review, where SOX has this kind of specific segregation of duties language. But again, it is the identical concept, and there's really no reason that you need to have these different from a procedural standpoint. So, as we've mentioned a few times through here, the concepts are the same. Even the language, with very few exceptions, is the same. So we don't want to be reinventing the wheel. You want to be looking at your existing GxP validation system and use those to validate your finance system. The other way works just as well. If you have a good testing practice in place for your finance, use that for your GxP system. I find more often it works the other way, that companies have invested a lot in developing really good testing and validation practices around GxPs, simply because the FDA acted sooner on this, and that legislation, Part 11, came out 5 years before SOX did. On the other hand, your finance department usually has better structures in place around long-term data archiving and warehousing, and that has already done a lot of security testing. So it's good to use those. So probably a little more interesting and important conversation than their similarities is, where are they different? And because this is where things can go wrong. Like I said, most of the work that we do for FDA systems and SOX systems from an IT perspective is very much the same, and there's no reason to not reuse it. But we also want to make sure that we're not reusing things that we shouldn't. So legacy systems. SOX does not have any provision for legacy systems. If you are using a system for financial reporting or that creates data that in any way long-term impacts a financial report, it must comply. There are no exceptions. Like Dave mentioned, the FDA does make some exceptions for legacy systems in Part 11, but I think that to Dave's point about how long Part 11 has been around, it's not a particularly valuable exception. Unless you were using your system in 1997, it is not a legacy system. Also, SOX does not have any discussions in the regulation itself or in the guidances around it that talk about copying records and the formats that your records need to be in. The FDA has generated a lot of discussion on this. I think partly this is just because it's not as much of an issue for people in the financial world. Financial data we're generally keeping in ERPs or similar systems, and there are only a few formats, and they're pretty common. A lot of times in lab systems, you may have a system that is kind of a very quirky one-off system that does a very specific piece of research, and it has a proprietary data format, and that's where we kind of end up with some struggles in terms of making sure that data is able to be copied and provided to auditors. So for the time being, from a SOX standpoint, I would strongly recommend, maintaining your financial data in its native format. Don't be trying to copy it and get it into different formats, unless some guidance is offered at a later date to the regulation changes there. Reporting. I think we've mentioned this a little bit earlier, but SOX is very prescriptive about proactively reporting issues. The FDA is much less so, unless you are directly involved in patient health. Certainly don't want to downplay adverse reporting, but for the most part, the FDA does not require you to let them know every time something goes wrong. And it's very important that your IT personnel be aware of this. If they're used to dealing in a GxP world and there's a security breach, they're going to follow your internal process. They're going to close it. They're going to fix the gap, and it probably is going to end there for them. But if it is a SOX environment, that is not going to be sufficient. There are also third parties that need to be notified, even if there wasn't a material fact. So I want to talk a little bit about when we put together a system for IT in across multiple regulatory agencies, who needs to be involved. I think this is where a lot of projects start to break down. You have somebody from the finance office, you have somebody from quality, then you have somebody from your IT quality, and you have somebody from your finance IT compliance, and then you have your end users, and you just end up with those kind of cases of too many cooks spoil the brew. And particularly when it comes to regulatory compliance, everybody comes to the table thinking, and probably correctly, that their concern is the most important. It's a regulatory issue. There's not a lot of room for error. From an IT side, you want to have one person who is responsible for IT compliance. And I think this is a little bit of a shift for a lot of companies. But there's really no reason that you need to have somebody that does FDA IT compliance and somebody that does Sarbanes-Oxley IT compliance. Certainly different on the functional end. There are different requirements around, what the system is going to do. But from the IT perspective, the way that we test and that we document and that we look at security and we protect security is all very much the same process. And you're going to be much better served by having one person that does that. Now, when I say one person, I mean, it may be one department because you may have a huge project that the workload is huge. But you don't want to have kind of two quality bodies even inside your IT department. You want to come up with one system that meets everybody's needs. From a functional perspective, certainly you need to engage all of your users, which includes compliance on both sides. Unless you're a very small company, combining SOX and GxP compliance beyond IT is probably going to get overly burdensome for that individual. And also just looking at who needs to be involved. It's not necessarily an IT concern as much, but the SOX is much more prescriptive about who needs to be involved in the processes. So you want to make sure, certainly FDA, we look at always bringing in end users and getting their opinions. But SOX is very specific that, you need to have officers involved, and they're very prescriptive about the fact that those people are individually criminally responsible for what happens. And I think that's another piece that is sometimes lost on the FDA side. Certainly people are personally responsible, but you don't have that direct criminal responsibility. And so they're not used to having quite the same stake in the game that people on the finance side are used to having. And I'm going to hand it over to Dave to talk a little bit about some of the standards that we can use to help us harmonize multiple regulations.
Okay, thanks, Ashley. So as we got towards the end of the webcast, we thought we'd talk a bit about standards and guidelines, as it's something that comes up quite frequently in our consulting work. In particular, people ask about COBIT, about ISO 27000, GAMP, ITIL, and ISO 9000 is a very popular one. Taking these in order, COBIT, or to give its full name, Control Objectives for Information and Related Technology, is a standard which was popularized by the Information Systems Audit and Control Association, ISACA, who are an international organization originally from the USA. They're the same group who provide certifications such as Certified Information Systems Auditor, Certified Information Security Manager, and such like. COBIT focuses on control of systems at a slightly higher level than some of the other things like ITIL, which I'll mention in a moment. And I think ISACA would like to see COBIT as an umbrella standard with the likes of ITIL underneath it. Having said that, at a high level, it's a pretty comprehensive standard, which if you get a copy, it runs to over 200 pages. COBIT's now up to version 4.1. I won't go into the history, but it's probably now best described as a process model that has 4 domains. The domains being plan and organize, acquire and implement, deliver and support, monitor and evaluate, and it has 34 processes inside those domains. And in each of these processes, there's a set of control objectives, some management guidelines, process descriptions, and what they call a maturity model. I actually quite like the COBIT maturity model quite a lot, as it tells you where you are on a scale instead of just being in or out of compliance with the standard. And the levels they use for the maturity model are no control is level 0, ad hoc controls are level 1, controls which are repeatable but intuitive are level 2, controls which are defined are level 3, controls which are managed and measurable are at level 4, and controls which are optimized at level 5. And I would expect life sciences companies to have procedures in place which are at least at level 3 according to COBIT. If they're not even repeatable, then you've probably got problems. ISO 27000 is actually a set of standards around information security. It starts at ISO 27000, 27001, 27002, etc. Versions are planned right up to ISO 27043, I think, of which 13 or 14 of these have already actually been published at the time of this webcast in February 2014. ISO 27000 itself is the overview of information security. 27001 outlines the requirements for information security management systems. 27002 is a code of practice. 27003 is implementation guidance, and so on. And there are existing or planned guides that go over metrics, risk management, and a whole other set of subdivisions of the area of information security. One thing I will say is, while very useful as checklists and guidelines, these are not really technical documents. You should look for your technical information elsewhere. GAMP is probably the best known of the guidelines that the life sciences industry uses. And we've mentioned GAMP and the GAMP guides in a lot of our previous webcasts, so I won't go into a great deal of detail now. I think it's enough to say that GAMP was originally published by the industry in response to new regulations around computer system validation, such as 21 CFR Part 11 that was just mentioned, in response to these regulations to provide an industry consensus which was endorsed by the regulatory authorities as to what current good practice really is. And it still fulfills that objective. Since Business and Decision and its predecessor, MI Services, has had input into every version of the main GAMP guide and a lot of the associated good practice guides that started coming out a few years ago, you'd expect us to recommend it, and we do. The main GAMP guide is up to version 5, which came out in 2008, and frankly, it's just starting to show its age a bit. For example, there's not much on cloud technology and almost nothing at all on compliance of software as a service. If you're interested in these areas, Business and Decision have done a number of webcasts, so listen to them or get in touch with us directly. ITIL, or the Information Technology Infrastructure Library, is a set of IT practice and standards that was partly derived from the old British standard BS 15000. It's a set of procedures, tasks, checklists and such like that aims to provide a baseline for certain IT standards. And as the name suggests, it's mainly based around infrastructure. The history of ITIL is quite complex, and the term ITIL is actually a trademark of the UK Cabinet Office, and the ITIL's publication's copyright owner is actually Crown Copyright, so they're technically owned by Her Majesty the Queen. But I wouldn't recommend us sending her any questions about it. ITIL started to become popular with the publication of version 2 in 2006, which was extended to version 3 in 2007, which in turn was revised in 2011, though it's still referred to as version 3. It's split into 5 areas, which are service strategy, service design, service transition, service operation, and continual service improvement. Most of ITIL has been taken into ISO standard 20000, though there are some small technical differences. You can get certification, both as an organisation and a person, in various parts of ITIL. It's most popular in Europe, particularly in the UK, for obvious reasons, although a lot of ITIL concepts and terms are becoming popular worldwide. For example, if you want to know why your company's help desk function is called a service desk, it's because that's what it's called in ITIL. ISO 9000 is worth mentioning, as it's a very common standard for establishing quality management systems for manufacturing and service industries. ISO 9000 itself describes the basics of quality management systems, while the related ISO 9001 is really a set of requirements that companies seeking ISO 9000 certification have to meet. It has to be said that there's been a lot of discussion about the usefulness of ISO 9001 certification over the years, despite the fact that a lot of companies require their suppliers to be ISO 9000 or 9001 certified. And this debate's still going on. I'm not going to contribute to that debate here, but I have been asked if a life sciences company that has ISO 9001 certification, does it mean that it's regulatory compliant? And the straight answer is no. You have to look at the regulations of the market in which you operate to be able to tell that. One thing I will say is if the company quality system is not up to ISO 9000, then it's highly unlikely that it will be regulatory compliant under 21 CFR Part 820 or Annex 11 of the European Union or really any other regulations. ISO 9000 is a fairly fundamental standard. Just to finish with this slide on that note, let me emphasize that all of these standards and guidelines are exactly that, standards and guidelines. And while they're very useful, and I do particularly recommend them, especially GAMP, they're not regulations themselves. We'll be taking your questions, and I see we've got one or two come in, and we'll be answering in a moment. So thank you to those of you who submitted questions so far. And please, everybody else, feel free to submit any additional questions now. So I think we do the first question. If you have a look at the questions coming in, Ashley, I'll take this first one. The FDA talks a lot about risk assessment and risk-based validation. Can we use a risk-based approach to SOX systems? Well, the answer is you can and should. The reason why the FDA has talked so much about a risk-based approach recently is because life sciences companies have not been following risk-based approaches until very recently. Other industries like finance have always been looking at the concept of risk. Not exactly in the same way and not risk of exactly the same thing. The FDA are obviously interested in public health and they don't necessarily care if your company makes a profit. But they have been talking about risk, and you can take a risk-based approach in exactly the same way, but you just need to think about risk of what. Do you want to pick the next one up, Ashley?
Sure. There's a question here. Please clarify the statement SOX and GxP require validation. To me, validation is testing in advance to predict standard results. SOX is ongoing testing to reconfirm results. So I think that's partly true. I mean, validation is an ongoing process. I think oftentimes we treat it too much as just testing beforehand, but validation does not end when the system goes live. You know, we do a lot of testing, we do a lot of verification up front, but we also have practices like change control and periodic review and things that we look at afterwards to make sure the system stays in compliance. With SOX, there is a much more rigorous kind of requirement for periodic review, and definitely looking at the long-term effects and checking very regularly that your controls still work. But you absolutely still need to validate up front. You know, if we put a system in place and we use it for 6 months and then we go back for 3 months, usually 90 days is the check there, and then we go back and say, okay, did it work? It's too late if it doesn't work, right? If I've got 3 months worth of garbage data in there, there's not really a way for me to go back and recreate that. So from a procedural standpoint, yes, it does focus on reconfirming results, but you absolutely need to do the verification up front to ensure that your system is working and not corrupting your data. Yeah.
And just to echo that, Ashley, I think it's worthwhile pointing out that the person talked about requiring validation being testing in advance, and that most regulatory observations about computer systems are not about the original validation of the system when it was first installed. They are about problems which have come up during the operational phase of the system. So any good validation plan will speak about maintaining the validated state as the system goes into operation, because that is where the area where most problems arise. Okay.
So there's another one here that I'll take 2 in a row if you don't mind, Dave. My system has been certified as FSMA compliant. Is that sufficient for SOX? Which I just think this is a really kind of good and interesting question. The regulations don't exactly translate one for one. I'm not sure who would really certify something as FSMA, and it's not likely that an auditor would accept I'm FISMA compliant as acceptable demonstration that you're compliant with SOX. Very much in the same way that, SOX, a SOX auditor is not going to accept an FDA compliance. But if you are compliant with FISMA, you will have met all of the security requirements and most of the technical requirements for SOX. What you're going to need to look at is the functional side, particularly around people and segregation of duties. It's something you probably would not have addressed when you were initially trying to comply with FISMA. FISMA looks at how the data is transmitted and it's protected and formatted, and it's very rigorous around that. But it doesn't look at kind of the same controls about who is creating the data and financial approvals. But on a positive note, I think if your company is mature enough that you are complying with FISMA, chances are very, very good that you're not going to find major gaps in your financial processes.
Okay, moving on. Question, is there guidance that tells me whether or not I need to comply with SOX? The answer to that is not really, but frankly, it's a pretty simple question. Firstly, is your company publicly traded in the US? If the answer is no, then SOX doesn't apply to you. Second, does your system handle any data that might find its way into a financial report if you are trading in the USA? If the answer is yes, then SOX applies. Be a little bit careful about just quickly saying SOX doesn't apply because the company is not publicly traded. Not that many companies exist as small private companies forever. So if you're planning to go public in the US or eventually be acquired, you're still going to want to make sure you've got basic financial controls in place. It's always easier to implement a system correctly the first time than it is to go back and try to retrofit controls later.
All right, I think there's probably time for one more here I'll take. When there's a conflict between Part 11 and SOX, which should take precedence? I'm not really sure how this would happen, although I've certainly been in a lot of meetings where people are under the impression that this is happening. The short answer here is both. They're both regulations. You're required to comply with both of them. But they really are saying very similar things about different data types. So if you find that you're having a conflict, I think it is most likely that you are looking at a bad interpretation at one or both of the regulations. What's probably happened is your QA department, from a GxP perspective, put in place a bunch of SOPs and controls, and then your financial compliance department put in a bunch of SOPs and controls, and you have conflict in those SOPs. It's not actually going to be a regulatory conflict, which is really comes back to why you want to have a single streamlined approach to IT compliance, and that you want to have one IT compliance department. Certainly you're going to want to get input when you're establishing that department from both sides. So you want GxP input, you want to get finance input, but at the end you need one system, you need one person, one department that's in charge. If there's I'm not sure who sent this question, but if there's a specific scenario you're thinking of, please feel free to shoot a question to our lifesciences@businessdecisions.com email address, and I'm happy to talk through that further. But I'm really pretty confident that the issue is a misinterpretation in your internal procedures and not an actual regulatory conflict.
Okay, I think we're just about coming to the end now, so I'll just take a minute or two to remind you of some forthcoming webcasts in the next few months. Next week, actually, we'll be looking at using sales intelligence and business intelligence in the life sciences and healthcare industry. In March, we're going to be doing a recap of our compliance fundamental series and take questions. If you're not familiar with the series, it's a series of recorded webcasts which address, as the name says, the fundamentals of regulatory compliance. We've only just got started on this series, so we're starting right at the basic level with questions like, should my company be compliant? What regulations apply? And we're moving on through validation planning, who the regulators are, and all this sort of thing. You can find all of those on the links to them, at least on the Business and Decision Life Sciences website, and there'll be a link to that in the information we'll send out. We're still finalising our May the 8th webcast topic. If there's something which is of particular interest to you, please send your suggestions to our lifesciences@businessandecision.com email address. And we do promise to answer every email which isn't spam. As I said, we'll be sending out an email to those attending the live webcasts with details of where you can download the slides. If you're listening to this as a recording via our website, you should already be able to find the slides on the same pages you're using to view the webcast. We do ask you to please rate today's session just before you go. Just press the Rate This button and you can rate the session and provide any comments or suggest topics for some new webcasts you'd like us to cover. As we've said once or twice, if you have any questions on any life sciences topic, you can submit them via the lifesciences@businessandecision.com email address. We do read and respond to the questions you submit there. If you have we also have our Life Sciences blog, and you can also follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn for a variety of up-to-date information pertinent to the life sciences industry. Thanks to Ashley Peacock for helping us prepare and present today's session. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you will be able to join us soon for another Life Sciences webcast. Goodbye.